I'm guessing we may have more people than would allow us to do introductions. But I do want to welcome, we have a group of colleagues and friends in Philadelphia. It's Girard Hospital, I believe, Bruno, right?
Behavioral Wellness Center at Girard, it's called.
Okay, yeah. And they have a internship program that's included a merit focus for the last 2 years. So welcome to you guys, welcome others. Welcome, Allison. We haven't seen you for a while. Nice to have you join us as well. And I won't introduce the rest of you, other than I guess we're going to be Kelsey Huling presenting today, along with Jay. And really looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, so yes, thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kelsey Huling, and I will be presenting with Jay Hamm today. And I work at Eskenazi Hospital, or for Eskenazi Hospital, which is a large community mental health center in Indianapolis. And the two clinics that I work in the older adult services clinic, so individuals with serious mental illness who are over the age of 60. And then the more relevant clinic to what we're talking about today, I work in the what's called the STARS clinic. It stands for Stabilization, Treatment, and Rehabilitation Services, which doesn't really say a whole lot about what population we actually serve. And so that's a specialty clinic for individuals with SMI and co-occurring intellectual disability. And so that's what we'll be talking about today, is sort of the application of merit in folks who have psychosis and intellectual disability. And so this is something that I've been thinking about and really trying to incorporate into my work since I started this position, which was in September of 2021. So that has been a really interesting sort of adventure and a lot of really interesting work. All right, so just a breakdown of sort of what we hope to accomplish today. So we'll start with an overview of intellectual disability, just really briefly, and then we'll discuss a brief background of co-occurring psychiatric and intellectual disability diagnoses. We'll kind of talk through the application of merit as a viable treatment approach for individuals diagnosed with intellectual disability and SMI, with some case examples thrown in to illustrate the different points. And then we'll have a more detailed case example at the end from a therapy client who I saw over the course of 2 years, who was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and an intellectual disability. And then finally, we'll move into the typical discussion and questions portion. All right, so I thought it would be really useful to sort of set the stage for intellectual disability and sort of make sure we're all on the same page. So intellectual disability is often used interchangeably with developmental disability or developmental delay, which isn't entirely wrong, but it's also not exactly right either. Developmental disability is more of an umbrella term that encompasses several conditions, including intellectual disability. So intellectual disability is a type of developmental disability. And diagnosis of intellectual disability is comprised of 3 components. And so the one that we probably all think of first is intellectual functioning, which looks like deficits in a range of intellectual and cognitive functions like reasoning, judgment, academic learning, abstract thinking, and judgment. And typically this is measured by a thorough standardized IQ testing, and usually requires an IQ score of 70 or less for diagnosis. The second component is impairments in adaptive functioning, where a person sort of fails to meet developmental and societal standards for independence and social responsibility. So without support from other people, these impairments typically affect functioning in a variety of life skills domains, including self-care, communication, independent living, and so on. And then finally, those deficits in intellectual and adaptive functioning must have an onset in the developmental period. There's no like specific age cutoff, but a common requirement that we often see is a diagnosis before age 22. This is just, I found this a helpful sort of graphic comparing mental illness and intellectual disability. So I can quickly go through this. Mental illness kind of affects approximately 20 to 25% of US adults, while intellectual disabilities affect approximately 1 to 3% of the US population. Mental illness, as we all know, impacts people's thoughts, moods, emotions, and intellectual disability is the below average ability to learn. Mental illness kind of has an onset at any age, but usually between 16 to 25. And then as we just talked about, intellectual disability is typically diagnosed in childhood or the developmental period. For mental illness, treatment is recommended after assessment of symptoms, kind of deciding what is best for that person based on what they're experiencing. And intellectual disability, there's no quote unquote cure for that. And it really remains pretty constant rather than having a more variable pattern. Of course, as we know, mental illness, there are intervals of remission, there's hope for recovery, but intellectual disability has a pretty fixed pattern. And then there's several different causes for intellectual disability. And those can include genetic issues, problems during pregnancy, poverty, trauma, all sorts of things like that. Okay, so I wanted to also kind of touch a little bit on sort of mental health and intellectual disability and how these things sort of come together. There are disproportionately high rates of psychiatric disorders, including psychosis, in people who are diagnosed with intellectual disability. And a study from 2007 estimated that around 40% of people with intellectual disability also have co-occurring mental illness. There's also exponentially higher rates of trauma and victimization in individuals who have a diagnosis of intellectual disability. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics special report on crimes against people with disabilities reported in 2007 that about 90% of all people with developmental disabilities, including people with intellectual disability, will experience sexual assault or physical violence of some time throughout their lifetime. So these are really prevalent things that are happening with this population and sort of offer a clear picture of why mental health treatment is so important for these people. All right, so a little bit of background on psychotherapy and intellectual disability and psychosis. This population, I think, as is likely no surprise to us here, is largely neglected in the psychotherapy literature. And really, this population has been historically viewed as poor candidates for talk therapy. And the few papers that do exist describing work with these clients tend to emphasize behavioral and symptom-focused approaches to treatment rather than approaches that promote meaning-making or self-reflection or intersubjectivity. And so there has been some more recent work calling for access to high-quality psychotherapy for individuals diagnosed with intellectual disability, as well as providing recommendations for ways to sort of modify therapy approaches for this population in ways that demonstrate clinical benefit for this population. And those kind of include things like simplifying language when having conversations with people, depending on sort of their cognitive abilities and their cognitive limitations. Shortening sessions, especially at the beginning when people are getting used to this and kind of trying to figure out how to tolerate something new. And then also incorporating creative and experiential interventions like writing or art, going for walks, things like that. All right, so now we'll kind of get into what we're really here to talk about. And so with all of that in mind, it seems as though merit may be an approach that really addresses some of these clinical concerns that we just talked about that continue to persist in treatment for this population. And so first, Merit is, as we all know, a flexible recovery-oriented approach where tailoring interventions to meet patients' unique needs has been a real key feature since the beginning. And specifically, I think the superordinate practice of Merit aligns with recommendations for modifying therapy when working with individuals with intellectual disability. And so it really kind of aligns with some of these calls that we've seen recently in the literature. And further, Merit provides sort of another answer to the calls for access to high quality therapy for individuals with intellectual disability. And I think the basic aspects of Merit have always moved beyond what's traditionally considered suitable for therapy, with the belief that recovery is possible despite a given person's symptom severity or level of impairment. And so since its inception, Merit practitioners have always worked with individuals with complex and severe psychiatric problems and disability. And so although it hasn't really been highlighted in sort of our body of work or research with Merit, I think that by the sort of core assumptions of this framework, our work has often included successful engagement of folks with intellectual disability. And then finally, I think Merit also serves to address several ethical obligations to offer people treatment that respects their differences, their personal autonomy, and combats stigma. And so in all of these ways, I think this really provides a solid argument for why this is an approach that would likely be really beneficial for people diagnosed with intellectual disability and serious mental illness. Of course, we know that everyone on this call knows and aligns with Merit's core assumptions, or you likely wouldn't be here on this call. So I'm not going to explain them to you. However, I think that it's most useful to use these core beliefs of Merit to demonstrate how this therapy approach makes sense as an integral part of treatment for individuals with co-occurring serious mental illness and intellectual disability. So from here, I am going to sort of highlight each core assumption and offer some case examples to illustrate those points. I guess before I transition into that, I know that there's obviously the portion for questions and discussion at the end, but does anyone have any burning questions now or any questions about anything that we've gone over so far?
Yeah, Kelsey, one of the things that were recommendations for therapy for folks with disability, you mentioned high quality therapy. Is there any kind of definition of what high quality therapy would constitute?
I think just something that sort of goes beyond trying to make behavior change for people, or that just focuses on remission of symptoms, just something that offers people a space for them to really think about their lives and sort of make meaning of what has happened to them throughout their lives. And that has something that has traditionally not really been offered to people that are diagnosed with these disabilities.
And thinking of that, did they provide examples of any therapeutic modalities or kind of approaches to providing therapy that would fall under that umbrella?
I think that they were essentially just, I think that there were different papers that said we're talking about different things like CBT or psychodynamic approaches, but basically the idea was just that no matter what sort of approach you're coming from, these modifications can be really helpful, and being able to get these therapies to people or make them more accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. So it wasn't necessarily the literature didn't necessarily say one sort of approach is better than the other, but was just saying here are ways that we can make these things more accessible to people who have cognitive limitations. Okay, is this just one slide then now?
Perfect, very nice.
Ah, okay, all right, sorry about that. That was probably not easy to read the slides or anything. All right. Okay, so we'll move on to the first assumption. So the first assumption of merit asserts that treatment is most effective when patients are active agents in their recovery. And so the combination of serious mental illness and intellectual disability, I think, makes this an especially important focus for this population. And this may very well be the first time that someone has ever asked them to make decisions for themselves or take control over their own recovery. And so it's pretty easy, I think, for patients to fall into the familiarity of deferring to mental health professionals to tell them what to do. And they're often already socialized to other people making decisions for them. And so, of course, this is even more complicated with someone who's been legally designated to make decisions for them, like a legal guardian, which is oftentimes something that we see in our clinic, that a large number of folks have legal guardians and people who are making decisions for them. And so that can be a really complicated thing to sort of, or a complicated barrier to sort of come up against.
Can I ask, and maybe this is covered later, what about clients that technically make decisions for themselves, but the decisions are always maladaptive? Like my client that is constantly demanding medication that doesn't suit her, or clients that are demanding to eat something unhealthy, even though it'll spike their chance of going to the hospital.
Sure. Yeah, I think that I don't know that I'd necessarily like address that in particular throughout the presentation. But I think that like in our work in this clinic, which I don't think there's any shortage of people who of seeing that, where we have people who want to eat certain things that seem to be causing medical issues for them or causing difficulties in their life, people who want to do certain things that are causing difficulties in their life. And I think we really take it like on a case-by-case basis. And I know that one thing that we really try to focus on is we really try to like take that element of sharing the therapist's mind and really offering our own concerns, our own thoughts about like how this could be, how this might be harmful, what we're concerned about. And if someone is capable of making their own decisions, then I suppose we do have to let them make those decisions. But we can still offer our thoughts, and they can take those thoughts or not. For people who do have like legal guardians or people who are making decisions for them, that can sometimes be a place where we bring the legal guardian in, because we're not always like I don't have legal guardians sitting in on therapy sessions or things like that. So that can be a place where we can try to collaborate with third parties and that sort of thing to help people maybe try to understand some of their decisions in a different way or make decisions that are, I guess, more adaptive for them.
Thank you.
Sure. And I definitely think that this can be a particularly challenging thing to break with patients, trying to, get them to be active agents in their treatment and their recovery can be a really tough thing. But there's a couple of things that stick out as common themes or important things to consider when working with this population. And I think that there's a couple common agendas that I found really important to pay attention to or to look out for that have become sort of key targets in my work with several patients. And the first is often looking for advice or instruction from me and hoping that I will tell them what to do. And so that's something that I tend to be acutely aware of. And the second is this theme of these competing desires to be treated normally and be treated just like everybody else, but then also wanting to get special treatment or liking part of that. Like there's part of it that feels good to get special treatment, part of it that feels good to not have to make decisions for themselves. I've also found that it's important to ensure that the that myself or the therapist in general is not forcing decision-making on people, I guess even when it's maladaptive. So that sort of speaks a little bit to the question earlier. And I think that because that can feel quite threatening to people, it can feel like we are telling them what to do. And maybe we're just sort of just another person in their life that is forcing them to do things or telling them what's best for them. And so I think that it's rather more helpful to open up a space to be curious about these things as they happen, and explore how to navigate these challenges in life. So if we go back to eating unhealthy things that might spike blood sugar and cause issues with someone's diagnosis of diabetes or something like that, we might think with them about like, what are the good things about this? What are the bad things about this? What kinds of things happen whenever you make these decisions? Are there other things that you've tried before? I guess just normally how we would explore decisions with people who don't have intellectual disability. And we would just kind of do the exact same thing there, figuring out if there are better ways to navigate challenges that come up for them. All right, so the second merit assumption requires therapists to act as an equal partner or a consultant. And this again can be challenging, yet I think imperative for recovery of patients with SMI and intellectual disability. And due to the circumstances of their lives, individuals with intellectual disability are more likely to expect a hierarchical relationship with other people in their lives. From my experience in the STARS clinic, the vast majority of patients have some sort of third-party involvement in their lives. And this might look like a legal guardian, like I mentioned before, or just a really involved family member. We do have clients who are technically their own guardian, but they have really involved family members that they live with or that they spend a lot of time with, or that they look to make decisions for them. Many of our patients in this clinic are also part of Indiana's Medicaid waiver program that provides community support and other services for individuals with disabilities. And these relationships also really tend to be hierarchical in nature. So these teams are typically telling them what to do. They're in charge of granting or removing privileges. They are creating behavior plans for people so they get to do certain things or they have certain consequences based on what their behavior is. And so there's a lot of control and there's not a lot of agency that people get in their lives. And so this is something that can also be really kind of hard to crack through. And one common agenda that I think seems really relevant to this assumption is the desire to be viewed as a good patient, especially one that has good behavior. Often people tend to sort of gravitate towards check-ins early on in therapy or giving weekly updates, reporting their symptoms, or reporting their good behavior. And it's felt sort of especially important to me to reflect on these observations with patients and try to understand those dynamics and where they're coming from. And I think exploring the novelty of this kind of relationship and understanding their reaction to it is imperative. And so through this, I think there is also plenty of opportunity to discuss opposing ideas between the therapist and the patient and really think through what it's like to disagree with one another. And finally, I think for this to be most successful for individuals with intellectual disability, therapists want to really remain open to vulnerability so that they're just as willing to be known by the patient, just as much as they are willing to know the patient. And I found that to be something that has been a key sort of agent of change in trying to sort of establish this non-hierarchical relationship, or as non-hierarchical as possible, is really being vulnerable, allowing people to know me and get to know me as a person in the room rather than another expert or another person who is just telling them what to do. And these points in particular remind me of a patient that I've been working with for about a year now. He is a 31-year-old white male. He does have a legal guardian who, and he has also been living in disability waiver services homes since he was about 17. So Indiana's Medicaid waiver, part of their services, they will offer housing for people who are struggling to find safe housing. Independent living is not going well for them. They're not able to live with family. And so he's been living in these sort of waiver homes since he was about 17. And at the beginning of our work together about a year ago, he often came in reporting good and bad behaviors from his week, usually expecting either praise or scolding, depending on what he was reporting on. And I intentionally reflected on these patterns between us in the room, which seemed to open up room for us to explore our differing ideas about what a therapy relationship looked like, as well as compare this new relationship to others in his life, both other mental health professionals that he's come into contact with or is currently working with, and other sort of third parties, like including his parents, his legal guardian, his waiver team staff. And through sort of a more curious consultant role, he eventually began sort of tolerating more of my presence in session, and began using therapy really as a place to think about his life and seek connection with someone else. And so painful themes of rejection and feeling unimportant really started to emerge. And then we were able to really jointly reflect on how these themes still affect him now and how he wants to navigate these things in a way that's different than he's been doing in the past.
Is the thinking with patients that have SPMI and ID different, and like maybe they're more concrete and can't necessarily go abstract? Yeah, sometimes I feel like my thought process doesn't match up with them because I'm more abstract.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think depending on the person's cognitive limitations. So I think that there are people that I meet with that are diagnosed with a mild intellectual disability that really don't have, I honestly don't see too much of a difference sometimes in my work with those folks versus people who aren't diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and their ability to kind of talk in a more abstract way, or think in a more abstract way. But yeah, I think people who have more of a moderate or severe intellectual disability might have more sort of a concrete process of thinking. And it is a bit of an adjustment to sort of change how you communicate with that person. And sometimes you have to use more concrete language and more simple. Sometimes I've been caught sort of saying words that people have never heard before, or words that people don't understand, or even saying sayings that people don't understand. And so I think that sometimes people are actually really good at letting you know if they're not understanding what you're saying or if they're not catching on. And so we've been able to really slow down, and I'm able to really share my thought process sort of like step by step. And kind of share my thoughts in a more concrete way with them that has felt like it has been helpful in being able to connect and understand each other.
Thank you.
All right. So the next assumption to highlight is the concept that human behavior and communication are meaningful, and experiences of psychosis can be understood. And so I already know that all of us on this call today have embraced the idea that experiences of psychosis can be understood. But for individuals with intellectual disability, I think this can be even more imperative to pay close attention to. I think the combination of disorganization and fragmentation, then paired with cognitive limitations, can really put the therapist at risk for interpreting things at face value sometimes. And it seems that all the common agendas that we've talked about so far can play a key role in this. So, for example, if a patient's agenda is to be the good patient, we may take their reporting of only positive events in their life as evidence that there's not really any distress going on, or assume that their cognitive limitations might hinder any more sort of nuanced accounts of their life. And so with that, it can be important to sort of actively avoid taking that stance and instead offer your mind about the content of session, as well as your desire or intentions to understand and know the person in their life beyond sort of their behaviors or beyond what is going well for them. And I think one thing that has been really helpful for me to say is that I believe that people have good parts and people have bad parts, and to really know someone and understand them, I need to know both of those things. And so that has been kind of helpful in trying to share with people what I'm looking for, and what I think will be, and what's, I guess, allowed to talk about. I think that there are also times with other people in their lives where they don't want to hear about the bad things that are going on. They don't want to hear about, all they really care about is, if there's no bad behaviors going on and there's no chaos happening. And so one thing that seems to be uniquely important to this population is the recognition of behaviors as communication. And you'll notice I put the word behaviors in quotes on the screen. And that was intentionally, because this has quickly become sort of one of my least favorite words over the past year and a half that I've been working in the STARS clinic. I think behaviors is so often used as a way to describe undesirable actions in people with intellectual disability, like saying, oh, John had behaviors last night. And I feel like that's so vague and it doesn't really describe to me at all what happened or why John was having behaviors or what happened. And so I think it also is often used as a way, maybe not intentionally, but a way to write off people's actions as behavioral or related to their intellectual disability, which sort of insinuates that these behaviors are completely random and unable to be understood. And so not only do I strongly believe that mental health and intellectual disability do not exist in their own vacuums, but very much intertwine in a way that's impossible to attribute something to one thing and not the other 100%. I also don't believe that there's really anything that's utterly random or unable to be understood. And I think human behavior should be first and foremost be approached as a form of communication, no matter what the person's cognitive limitations are. And I think a focus on narratives here can be really helpful in trying to help people reflect on their behavior and what it could mean. And it's possible and often happens that people aren't really sure. They don't really know how to articulate what these behaviors are, or like why they're happening. And so really trying to elicit narratives and try to help them figure that out can be really helpful. And I think also depending on the person's cognitive and intellectual functioning, this is where adaptations to interventions can be really essential. So for example, I see a 39-year-old client. He's a white transgender male, and he often writes narratives out on a tablet for me to read and for us to then subsequently reflect on. So he'll have them written out. I will read them and then we can think about them together. And that's because he often has a hard time expressing himself in the moment in a way that feels good to him. He has a harder time processing like a lot of information at once. And so we'll spend some time talking about things. He will go home and think more about it and then sort of write down his thoughts, write down narratives and stories from his life, and then we can reflect on them the next time we meet together. Another patient I saw for a period of time was a 20-year-old Vietnamese man diagnosed with autism, and he had very limited verbal communication skills. And during an early session, I noticed the movie The Matrix in his pocket. And I asked him about that. And ultimately, we ended up watching that movie together. And I spent time like really taking note of the different scenes that he might react differently to. And then I attempted to really understand him through those reactions. And like we were then able to talk a little bit about his favorite characters, different scenes that he liked and why he liked those scenes better than others. And so that was another really interesting way that I think I tried to elicit narrative episodes from somebody. Another sort of case example that I think really helpfully illustrates this is when I think about behaviors. There was a particularly powerful group session that comes to my mind that happened maybe a month or so ago. I facilitate a weekly process group in the STARS clinic. We have about a steady attendance of about 7 to 10 people. All of them have serious mental illness, of course, and the vast majority of them are diagnosed with moderate intellectual disability. We often find ourselves discussing behaviors and anger in group, particularly those behaviors that are violent and destructive. And every group member has experienced some form of sexual trauma. It's not a requirement for the group, it's just sort of how that turned out. And just about every group member has been arrested and incarcerated for assault at some point. And if they haven't, they've been hospitalized for similar incidents. And so this specific week, we were having a discussion about what they were trying to communicate beyond anger when they blow up. And blow up was sort of their term that they were using to discuss these things. And so these really sort of rich narratives and powerful themes came up, including a perception of being unsafe, feeling dismissed, being treated like a child, having no control, not having the right words to express their inner experiences, and being misunderstood or feeling as though people didn't know how to interact with them, or one person said people don't know how to handle people with disabilities. And I think what was even more striking was that it didn't really take a lot of skill or a lot of questioning to get sort of this wide array of experience. It just turns out when I asked them about this that no one had ever really asked them in those moments what they needed, what was going on for them, or why they were doing these things. No one really tried to understand it or think about it with them. Instead, they just labeled them as behaviors, and the police were called or the ambulance was called. And then the patients continued in this cycle of feeling even more misunderstood and unsafe. So I think that was sort of a really powerful illustration to me of like how behavior and communicate is really a form of communication, and through trying to understand those things, we can really make meaning of what's happening for people. All right. So this next assumption is sort of a controversial one for this population, especially with third parties who are involved in patients' lives. There seems to be sort of this unfounded belief that people with intellectual disability can't handle pain, or that reflecting on the painful parts of life will harm them in some way. I often hear that it will probably increase people's behaviors or cause them to backslide. And of course, we all know well the consistent pattern of that's seen across merit studies, that greater awareness often leads to increased distress, which can include exacerbation of symptoms and hospitalizations and things like that. However, I strongly believe that just as individuals with psychosis are not fragile beings to be protected, neither are people with intellectual disabilities. And they should also be afforded the right to experience pain and make sense of their lives if that's something that they want to do. And so I've found that bringing in dissenting third parties and helping them understand sort of what the justification behind all of this is, that we're not just trying to open up Pandora's box and leave people to fend for themselves, but that we are offering reasons for why processing these painful experiences could be helpful, and how that's been successful in the past, has been helpful in removing those barriers for people. And I think particularly discussing how making sense of trauma and other psychological problems that arise will ultimately result in, hopefully, people being better able to navigate pain and stressful life events when they come up. That sort of helps those third parties get more on board with that. And then the idea is that hopefully, as people sort of have a better understanding of their psychological problems, they have a better developed mastery, people may start needing things like behaviors less to get their needs met. Let's see. In the interest of time, I may skip this case example and move on to this next one. So the last but definitely not least assumption is the importance of recognizing that stigma is widespread in all of us. And this seems to be a central theme in working with individuals with intellectual disability, particularly considering double stigma and the complex sort of intersection of serious mental illness and intellectual disability. And so many people also tend to have high degrees of internalized stigma, in which they start coming to believe the stereotypes and stigmatizing ideas that general society has about them. And some common themes that I tend to notice are those related to believing that they're inherently dangerous people that need to be controlled. There are also all kinds of stigmatizing ideas about what people with intellectual disability are capable of, or what's appropriate for them in life, including marriage and engagement in sexual activity, drinking alcohol, and so on. And so I think being highly aware of those dynamics emerging in session and emphasizing reflection on those dynamics can help therapists avoid falling into stances like benevolent stigma or sort of the pattern of the incapable person and the protector. And so one thing I found useful, but even more so with this population, is being acutely aware of my own reactions while I'm in session with people. So being aware of if I'm feeling protective of the person, or if I'm feeling frustrated, or if I'm feeling pity for them, and any of the other possibilities for reactions can be such a clue into what kinds of biases or stigma is coming up for me. And so really intentionally utilizing my own mind and sharing my thoughts and experiences has been a key agent of progress in my work with people surrounding stigma. So offering my thoughts about what someone is capable of, and then being able to reflect on that and their experience of my mind has been really helpful in combating stigma for people, as well as avoiding falling into that trap myself. And so someone who really comes to mind here for me is a patient in his mid-60s. He's a Black male diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and mild intellectual disability. And stigma, especially internalized stigma, comes up really regularly in our work together. Early on, he would come in and make these sorts of confessions about sexual fantasies and substance experimentation, missing medication doses, or getting angry at somebody. And he would expect me to sort of scold him or tell him that those things are bad for someone like him. And of course, I didn't do that, but I was able to share my own thoughts about these topics that seemed to differ greatly from his own. And so through thinking about those things, we're now able to sort of talk about how stigma has affected him throughout his life in a negative way, such that he never pursued gainful employment or marriage or having a family of his own because he thought it wasn't allowed. And we also have had some pretty powerful conversations surrounding rejection from other people related to stigma. For instance, we've discussed how people in his life have stopped getting to know him and treated him differently after discovering his diagnoses. And in turn, he then decided to just kind of tighten his circle and cut people out to only mental health providers, family, or other people with disabilities because they were less likely to reject him than other people. And so now we can reflect on sort of how that's caused him to feel largely unknown for his whole life, which is a really painful realization for him in his later years. So I have like a few additional considerations, but then also the case example. But in the interest of time, I know that it's already 10:49, and I wanted to make sure that I could turn it over to Jay in enough time for him to sort of talk about the points that he has. So if we have time at the end, we could come back to the case example and think through it more. But that's all that I've got for now.
Kelsey, a couple of my thoughts were actually in response to the longer case example and having it supervised it. So I'm fine if you want to go on a little bit longer with that, and then.
Oh, sure. Okay.
To that.
Well, I will try to skate through it really fast. So this individual is someone that I worked with on when I was on practicum here at Eskenazi while I was in school still. And we worked together for 2 years. And then we took about a year off when I was on internship. And then I now meet with him again now that I'm back working in the Eskenazi system. And so he is a 67-year-old Black male. He's not married, he's unemployed, and he has 10 years of education. His current diagnoses are schizoaffective disorder and mild intellectual disability. Sort of just a brief psychiatric and developmental history. He was diagnosed with mild intellectual disability and behavior problems since early childhood. And he was treated on and off at different state psychiatric facilities for this from ages 5 to 14. So he has been highly institutionalized since a very early age. He experienced his first episode of psychosis when he was 16, and this was after the tragic death of a friend, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia at that time. And he was in a few different state hospitals for some time, and it's kind of unclear how long, but I think some of the stays were obviously longer than others, but he did spend a significant amount of his life in a state hospital. He has been in treatment since around that time, since he was, released from the state hospital and in his 20s. And he is probably around, I guess, over 40 years. And so he's had several hospitalizations in that time. And he had 2 while we were working together in those 2 years. Since we've been working together since then, he has not been psychiatrically hospitalized. He did have some pretty serious complications after contracting COVID, and he was in the hospital medically for a long time. And then he was also then discharged to a nursing home, which was a really difficult experience for him. And he is having some different cognitive difficulties after that sort of stint with COVID, which has been interesting to try to navigate together. It wasn't part of our relationship before, so that's been interesting. He has been doing merit for actually probably, I don't know why I put 4 years there. It's probably been like 6 or 7 years at this point. Would you say, Jay? Yeah. So about 6 or 7 years, and he's been with at least 3 or 4 different students. And then now, like I said, we are meeting together now as well. And as I mentioned, he's a pretty heavily institutionalized person. He's been in lots of state hospitals throughout his life and has been in mental health treatment for a really long time. Some social history. He currently lives in a residential, like an Eskenazi residential facility. He had when we were working together toward the end of my practicum, he had a roommate who recently died. So that was something that we sort of were able to think through together. He has 3 siblings, 2 brothers and 1 sister. His sister passed away from cancer And his mother has also passed away, but both of his brothers are still living. His parents were never married, and he was raised by a single mom. He had an abusive stepdad and a really religious mom who he holds on a pedestal most of the time. He was raised in the Midwest, mostly lived with mom until she passed away. And his family really infantilized him in a lot of ways. And they had a lot of their own difficulties with stigma about what it meant for him to have a mental health diagnosis and intellectual disability. He typically has, or he reports that in the past he had a lot of friends and he's a pretty social guy. But as we've talked more and more, it became clear that a lot of those relationships were very surface level and often used as a way to protect himself rather than something that was, intimate or had interpersonal closeness within it. And as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this earlier, he was part of one of the other case examples. He's really reduced his circle to just mental health providers and family at this point. He's never been married, but he has had significant relationships in the past. He left school his sophomore or junior year after his initial episode of psychosis. He reports that the school refused to let him return. They didn't think that he would be able to finish. And this is still something he would like to accomplish, that he still talks about now, getting his GED. He has had several service jobs that I think he worked at a gas station once, and he worked as a security guard once. But his most long-term was not a gainful employment job in the community, but he worked at sort of a convenient shop that the clinic had for about 15 years. And he worked selling food and snacks and drinks at that convenience shop for a long time. So here's just an illustration of sort of over the initial 2 years that we worked together. The beginning of our work together, I rated his self-reflectivity at a 3, mind of the other at a 2, decentration 0, and mastery at a 1.5. And then after our 2 years of working together, he was reaching levels of about 7.5 for self-reflectivity, 5.5 for mind of the other, 0.5 for decentration, and then a 5 for mastery. I also have some other thoughts about just working through the elements and that sort of thing with him. But I'll let Jay sort of share his thoughts, and then we can sort of talk more about that if it seems relevant.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can just kind of build off with a few remarks. I think that maybe just to put a sharper point on a couple of the things that Kelsey had touched on, I think using merit in this way for people with intellectual disabilities really opens up an opportunity to have people be seen as someone who could potentially be understood and somebody who could fully participate in therapy. And I think maybe back to even Emil's question earlier in this issue of what does it mean to offer someone quality therapy? I think what happens in real world settings is that people with intellectual disabilities are just kind of bossed around or benevolently given advice, encouraged to do things that we think are healthy because we know what's best for them, and sort of protected from their pain. And I think what Kelsey's describing here is a sort of radical claim in a similar way that it might be radical that somebody with psychosis become to be understood and can partner with a therapist and think through really deep problems in a serious way that could lead them to have a better sense of themselves as an agent, to come to terms with the trauma and pain that they've experienced, and to figure out what they want to do with themselves. This case example that Kelsey shared here was really impactful for me as a supervisor. I had known him from around the clinic and had connected him with Jackie actually when she first started as a student. and then supervised his case over transitions from a couple of different students. And prior to Kelsey coming on board in whatever year that was, he had been, he'd been in therapy for 3 or 4 years at that point. And I had sort of convinced myself that we had hit some kind of ceiling with what he could do in Merit. The sessions were getting incredibly repetitive with the prior student. And it wasn't really clear to me that just continuing to transfer him from student to student was what would be best for either the student or for him. And I had the thought of maybe just trying to transition him back to his regular care team where he wouldn't be getting Merit. And I talked to him about it a little bit, and he sort of insisted that that was not the case, that he wanted to stick with my students, that it was really important to him. And he does it in his own way. That did not certainly involve an eloquent account of the changes that he was experiencing, but he made it clear to me that he was serious, that he didn't want to switch back to just regular care team, that he wanted to stick with my students. And then in the 2 years that he worked with Kelsey, and then an additional time after Kelsey had gone, it was remarkable to me the amount of continued progress he made, which I think is certainly a lesson to me about the importance and value of having space for really long-term work with people who have really long-term problems. But also that we don't know what's possible still, even after we've been working with someone for some time. We still don't have crystal balls. And I think, and I'm sure what Kelsey would have gotten into with some of those final slides was a little bit about how these same narratives kept getting revisited. And they got revisited across the transitions of different therapists, but especially this seminal event of trauma when he's an adolescent. He goes back to it over and over again. And over time, just the richness of it, the amount of detail he could both share with another person and also think to himself about what it meant to him and how it had impacted his life was really remarkable. And as a supervisor, one of the most, I think, moving and educational experiences I've had following a case along. I'd say, in thinking about my own work, I'll try to share a brief case example here and also talk a little bit back to, for those of you that were here a couple of times ago when I talked about supervision and book club. I'll tie a book club anecdote in here, but I've got a 39-year-old guy that I've been seeing mostly continuously for about 8 years. There was during COVID about 6 or 9 months that he was totally out of treatment. He was working in a grocery store and things got really busy and intense for him. And he fell out of treatment for a little bit and then came back. For a while, early on, I was seeing him weekly. We scaled down to where I was basically seeing him about once a month. And now that he's back in regular, I see him every 2 weeks, and that seems to be going well. But this is a guy who was receiving kind of supportive therapy before I met him, and had managed to really alarm his therapist at the time by describing a sexual fantasy that he'd had about her. And so she asked if I could start meeting with him. She was uncomfortable meeting with him anymore. He's a pretty big guy. He's he's well over 6 feet tall, large frame, has at the time a really prominent stutter, made it difficult for him to speak at length about different topics. And when I first meet him, the amount of internalized stigma is really remarkable. Stutter is really prominent and interferes with our discussion. He will often go on long lists of negative terms that he applies to himself. For instance, I'm a freak, I'm a geek, I'm a spaz, I'm a weirdo, I'm a psycho, I'm a pervert. He do this over and over again, as well as describe in incredible length in his way about his masturbatory fantasies and things that would generally just be deemed as inappropriate. He'd be redirected and told to do different things. And similar to these reflections that Kelsey shared about ways that merit could be applied, I think in work with him, I've just sort of slowly gotten to know him and gotten beyond some of the superficial things that are so socially unpleasant or that are off-putting to people. I've learned about his close friend who was seemingly the only person he felt really understood him, but who was tragically struck as a pedestrian and killed at the very beginning of our work together. Have met with him and thought with him about losses that he's had, including death by suicide of his sister while we were working together. Slowly over time, really kind of thought together about what it's like to be a disabled person, and how he recognizes his limitations. And there are certain things that he struggles with that he needs his mother to help him with. There are certain jobs that are unavailable to him because they would be too complicated for him to navigate. But a desperate desire to be seen as a normal person, to live in the world, to pursue things that are meaningful. In my work with him, I don't think I've done major modifications to Merit as usual. I've tried to, adjust to his capabilities, to not speak over him, although this is something that's come up and we've had to think through. There are times where I've used vocabulary that confused him or talked too long, and it somehow got him mixed up, and we've had to think through those sorts of moments of miscommunication or where we're not really on the same page. Trying to find his agenda from week to week has been important, as sometimes he just really does not want to go into the deeper things, the heavier things. He wants to talk to me about his favorite television shows of the 1990s, or his incredible knowledge of 1990s grunge music, his favorite music videos, etc. But I think, all of the major themes that might be seen in any kind of depth psychotherapy have come up and have been part of the work. We talk about sexuality and trauma, religion, independence, stigma, loneliness, his fear of his mother's death eventually, and what he'll do when he doesn't have her to rely on so much. There have been times when I, like Kelsey's example with her client, that where I felt like maybe this is as much as I can do with this guy, and maybe I'm not sure. Maybe he's just grown dependent on the social connection with me, and we're not really doing real work anymore. There were times when I had had conversations with him about termination, but similarly, he insisted that he wanted to keep working with me. And there was a time when he just wanted to be seen once a month, but he wanted to hang in there with me. And since he's come back from his time off, I've found that the work has been deepened, and he has continued to make progress in a way that surprised me. One comment about book club that I would say is, I can't remember how long ago it's been now, but we came across this book that was published in 1957 by a Norwegian writer, Tarjei Vesaas. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the book is called The Birds, and it follows a story of a 40-year-old disabled man who lives in the Norwegian countryside with his sister. And many of these same themes about the complex ambivalence, where somebody recognizes their own limitations but wants to be treated as a full person, or seen as quote unquote normal. And these things are quite poignantly dealt with in the book. And for me personally, I found the book quite moving, and the discussion that we had in our group supervision was additionally impactful and made me, something that was really on my mind a lot. And I don't think that prior to reading the book or discussing it with our students and colleagues that I'd been neglecting some of those issues entirely in therapy. But I have found that since we did that book in book club, that I've been much more acutely attuned to these themes in the work with him, it seems like he is better able to open up about them in a way that it's not clear to me if there's something that shifted where I've become a more subtly more empathic to those particular issues, but they've certainly come up more and more in the work with him. So another, I think, plug for how book club has been such a interesting and enriching experience ongoing. So I think with that, I will take a pause and maybe we can see if there's discussion or questions from the group, or if Kelsey has any other thoughts in response to my remarks.
I don't know if people are waiting for me to share any thoughts, but I mean, I'm sure I could think of plenty of thoughts to sort of like, think more about and talk more about, like that sort of align with what you were saying. But I am curious to hear if other people have thoughts and give people space to like share, what came up for them, or ask any questions that they might have, or things that we didn't talk about that you were curious about.
Well, I mean, I could say one thing that comes to my mind, really strongly is what it means to say someone can't handle their pain. And I think you do correctly and very nicely explain that this is, sometimes a barrier that we feel like we may be asking people to deal with stuff they can't deal with. And I'm not sure where in the world that sort of crazy thought comes from, but I certainly think one foundation of that is a fear ourselves that we can't handle pain, and that we're not going to be able to bear it or won't know what to do if someone should disclose pain. And there's a kind of fear of the uncertainty that will ensue if you allow pain to emerge, because you don't know the solution ahead of time. So easier to figure out what is, quote, the behavior, which is code for stuff you want them to stop doing. And then there's no possibility that uncertainty will unfold or appear. And I guess this is in part of reflection also, Jay, about what you shared about how you weren't sure how the book may have helped, but there was a kind of openness maybe that emerged. And perhaps that is allowing something to happen where neither party knows what's going to go on. And patients certainly sense our own hesitancy that maybe this is dangerous. And when we're comfortable with that uncertainty emerging, then it's hard to imagine anyone who couldn't bear pain and think about it and live with it.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point and an important thing to like think about too. It made me think of, I think there's a lot of times, I think I mentioned several times, like third parties and things like that, who not only do they like kind of push against the idea that someone should be processing their trauma or things like that, but I've also heard clients who have told me, like, when I bring up things that have happened to me in the past, or when I try to talk to people that I think I can trust in my life about these things, they tell me, oh, well, that happened in the past, let's move on. And it does feel like that sort of, no, this is dangerous, we shouldn't talk about it type thing. And I think that really does happen a lot. So I think that's a really good point.
It also brings to mind, and I think this was an insight from Valerie Sinison, who had written one of the sort of rare pieces at length about doing work with people with severe psychiatric difficulties and intellectual disability. But she talks about that people that do not have intellectual disability struggle to relate to people with intellectual disability because of our fear of our own limitations and our own stupidity. So, when we see the limitations in the other person, we're actually quite threatened by it because of our own potential of this happening to us in terms of cognitive decline or just our own limitations, what we don't know what to do. And one example that I can recall her bringing up is sort of like talking to the person who is not making a lot of sense or has, but you sort of smile dumbly back and pretend that you know what they're talking about so as to not offend them or to not to introduce something uncomfortable. And instead of just being direct and saying, I didn't follow what you said there. Can you please try again? I'm trying to understand. And I think that kind of stuff happens with people with disorganized speech and psych.
Oh, I think you froze. Oh, I think you froze for a second, Jay.
I think I just trailed off. Oh, now it says connection unstable.
I think the last thing I heard in the point that you were trying to make was that this happens with people with disorganized speech, and then it went away.
Yeah, I didn't say much more after that.
Okay.
I was just going to mention.
Oh, no.
I was just going to mention that I think this particular discussion really highlights how like the critical role that merit plays in creating a place for people that in everyday life and in society definitely don't have that place, and that the function of that really ends up allowing them to, create a relationship with themselves, sit with pain, and that just leads to so many other things and so much more meaning making. So I've really enjoyed these particular examples.
One thing I'm curious about, and potentially both for Kelsey and for Jay, it's what it's like communicating with other professionals in the hospital that you work at. So if you're working with someone you're thinking about using merit and communicating with people, what it means to help them make sense of things, but especially in the context of developmental disabilities and the way that people are infantilized or the agency is viewed as compromised, and what it's like to talk to other healthcare professionals about their intentional decision-making, say on medication, and whether you see additional challenges for folks with developmental disabilities and how you navigate that.
Well, I think that it is, I think it's been really difficult. I think it depends on the person. I think that there's obviously a spectrum of healthcare providers who are more open and have sort of similar ideas to what we're talking about now. And then there are also still, unfortunately, the last assumption we talked about of like stigma is present in all of us. I think that there's still a lot of stigma in a lot of healthcare providers, including people who prescribe medication, including people who do therapy, all of the above. And I think that it can be really difficult. And, but I think that I try to talk to people really intentionally. And I also I tried, I guess, to pick my battles in a way of like which things feel most important, or which things feel like they will be received in the way I want them to, versus which things feel like I'm just pushing against something that may not be useful or helpful. And sometimes it does feel like, I guess, hitting a wall in a lot of ways. Like sometimes it does feel like things don't get through to people, or people think that I'm kind of crazy and don't know what I'm talking about sometimes. Or, but I think that there have been some really rewarding conversations that I've had with people. I recently just had a conversation with, that's coming to mind, with a manager at another clinic. And he, wanted to consult with me about a client in one of their residential facilities who is an older adult and also has an intellectual disability, who is having behaviors during different times of the day. And they're trying to figure out ways. It's kind of causing issues with other clients who live in that residential facility. It's causing staff members to feel unsafe because this person will oftentimes get really loud and aggressive and sometimes violent. And so he was calling to consult about just kind of, what can we do here? Like, what have you found helpful? And I think he sort of started off by saying, I've been trying to figure out for a really long time what this person is trying to gain from these behaviors. And so he was sort of coming at it in a way that he was sort of approaching it as this person was trying to, I don't know if he would use the word manipulative or not, but that's sort of what it seemed, that this person was trying to gain something that they wanted from the team. And instead, I think I tried to reframe it in this way of like, instead, what is the person trying to communicate to you? Like thinking of it in a way that a behavior is a communication rather than a way to gain something. And that felt, I guess, pretty helpful to him. And it felt like a rewarding conversation where we were really trying to think about this person in a different way that he hadn't thought about them before. And like whether that person was feeling unsafe at the home. And then that's when these things came up, or maybe the person wasn't feeling listened to. And that's why these behaviors were coming up for them and that sort of thing. And so I think it really varies depending on the person and how those conversations go. And they can be really difficult and sometimes frustrating to have, I think, with people, because there's still a lot of stigma out there and a belief that people can't make decisions for themselves, especially if they have a legal guardian, that they don't have to be involved in decisions about their care, which is really tough to push against. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Jay. I just rambled on for a really long time, but.
No, I think it's great. I don't have much different, I guess it is in some ways similar to my experience of trying to communicate with other professionals or systems about people with psychosis as well. There's a similar challenge about trying to introduce the notion that things can be understandable, that people have interior lives, that they couldn't just be reduced down to an object that should be controlled, but also a kind of ambivalence or tension about my role as an advocate for a person and trying to help people develop agency and not to subtly reinforce some of the stigma by leaping in to save the day, because for one, it usually doesn't work and the day is not saved, and two, it also just kind of reinforces that the person can't do it on their own. But there are some times, I think, where persons, maybe their intellectual difficulties are truly interfering with their ability to navigate some particular situation, and they could be helped out by Kelsey having a conversation with their behavior team or whatever, So I think that those tensions certainly exist that are maybe even pronounced in these cases where both intellectual disability and psychosis are at play.
Yeah, that actually brings up a memory of this was several months ago, and it didn't necessarily it did result in the client ultimately sort of getting what they were trying to advocate for themselves, and getting what the treatment that they wanted. But it didn't necessarily result in, I would say, my having a better relationship with their waiver team. But like one of the things that their behavior consultant, who is someone who makes behavior plans and does a lot of sort of behavioral interventions and that sort of thing, was trying to sort of enact in their behavior plan was that if they had if they acted out or had a quote unquote behavior while they were at the clinic here, that they were then not allowed to come here the next week. And so they were essentially trying to remove mental health treatment as a consequence to, trying to communicate something, or having unwanted behavior of some kind. And so the client was not having good success at trying to advocate for herself. And she really was trying to do that. She was sharing why treatment was important to her, and why she wanted to continue to come to her appointments weekly. And so we did, as like a treatment team here in STARS, sort of step in and try to offer our justifications for why we did not think that that would be helpful for her, and why we thought that removing mental health care as a consequence to something was a bad idea. And ultimately, she ended up being able to still come in and still come to her mental health appointments. But we sort of had to discuss, like, you know, if this keeps happening, we have to, there's different governing bodies that say that like waiver teams have to take people to their mental health appointments and things like that. And so we had to say, like, this is not ethical, and it may even not be legal for you guys to do this. And so that was a more difficult conversation that I'm not sure resulted in us having a better relationship with the waiver team, but we were able to help the client essentially get what she was looking for and what she wanted.
So one thing I also find myself wondering about, I guess there are two things that maybe are independent, I guess we'll see. But one is, I think we're all aware that it is possible for therapists to do nothing in therapy for eons, and it's sort of a pointless activity. And so I think, you know, it's all incumbent on us to sort of struggle with this idea of when is nothing happening. And I feel like that's itself even a therapeutic process. And that seems like that's highlighted, Jay, in your discussions with the fellow about whether you ought to quit. But the other part, though, which I think in some ways connects to this, is that we operate in environments, I think all of us, where deeply meaningful behavior is often stripped of that meaning and seen as a symptom or a behavior. And we are urged to step back and not actually see what's going on. And it almost feels like it's aggressive. And my sense, Kelsey, when you talked about what you do when dealing with staff and trying to help them see what you're up to and what the patient is up to, is you want to sort of restore meaning to the activities of the person. And, you know, and you also do that too, Jay, in your case example of the fellow who is talking about things that make everyone uncomfortable, which are of a deeply sexual and personal nature. But I feel like, I mean, in this really great presentation, you've come back again and again to these things as meaningful, and to a reconsideration of what it means when we do nothing, and to be able to think about that as part of the process, again, without writing people off. So I really appreciate that about what you've shared today.
Yeah, well, I think that's well put, Paul. I mean, it seems to me like, and just watching the impact Kelsey has had on that clinic and the kind of the ways in which people are talked about, I do think this idea of trying to restore meaning or shine a light that the meaning is possible is a key part of a shift up there. And so it's been really refreshing to see in a kind of, you know, branching out into sort of new territory within our own system here, that people, and, you know, it's not to criticize everybody that was already existing. There are plenty of people who would have been naturally inclined to it and needed kind of a bit of a, you know, permission to think about people in this way, because it was kind of pushing against some of the status quo. And so I think what seems to have been useful over the last year or so is for some of those folks that having space to have these conversations and think with people about what things might mean instead of how to control them has really been refreshing for those other staff that maybe were naturally inclined this way but hadn't had prior exposure to these concepts.
Okay, well, it looks like we've hit the time barrier. I sure want to thank Kelsey and Jay for an excellent presentation and discussion. Thank you, all of you who've joined, including those of you who are new to this meeting. We're really glad to have you join, and also it's great to see the rest of you here as well. So thank you so much for everything. Reed, thank you for organizing, and we will see you all at our next quarterly meeting, which is yet to be determined, but we'll have information for you soon. Thank you so much.